towards the ship. Very good. Okay. We'll get started, everyone. Good evening. Lovely to see everyone again virtually on Zoom. See your faces. We are up to Vayera this week and another action-packed Sedra, and lots to talk about. So we'll go through, as always, picking out key ideas from different pasukim. Hopefully, we'll sort of get a kind of feel for the key ideas and the themes of this week's Parsha, as well as some messages to take away. For those of you who've been to the last few Shiurim, one of the things you might have realized, and I'm sure you would have, given how much time we spent discussing both Noah and also Lech Lecha, in terms of those words, not just the Parshiot, is that I put a huge importance and value on the names, the titles of the Parshiot. I think names in general in Judaism tell us a huge amount about identity, about character, about values, about the themes and the ideas we're looking into, both in the Parshiot and in a broader sense. And actually, when we get to Shemot, which is, of course, an entire Parsha and indeed an entire book about names, we'll talk about that in more detail. But I think that looking at the way the beginning of our Parshiot are structured and indeed how they end really helps us to gain an understanding of the key ideas and the themes and the messages we're supposed to be taking away. And that is no more true than in Vayera. The way the Parsha begins and the way that the Parsha ends is particularly fascinating. And the name of the Parsha is particularly fascinating because Vayera, which means in this context, and he appeared, talking about Hashem, and Hashem appeared, as we can see here, the root of Vayera is Yireh, to see. And this theme of seeing and appearing and looking and raising one's eyes, this theme is repeated consistently throughout the Parsha, over and over again. I haven't done the maths on this to check, but I believe this is the time that the root of the word of the title of our Parsha appears by far the most in said Parsha throughout, more than any other time in the Torah. You'll see as we go throughout this idea of Vayera, appearing, Vayar, seeing, Vayisa Einav, raising eyes, all of these ideas. Looking is such a key theme in all different contexts. It comes up in almost every different story, and we have wonderful sort of 6 or 7 different stories, fascinating stories, and the sort of theme throughout seems to be this idea of looking. So we're going to have that in the back of our minds as we go through this idea of looking. Why is that such a key theme? What's the idea that we're supposed to understand from that? So we go to the verse number 1. Vayera elav Hashem. Now the Lord appeared to him, to Abraham, in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. This is how we start our Parsha off, and the context of this introduction is that it's just after Abraham's Brit Milah. That was how we finished off the last Sedra, and that's what's happened now. Abraham's just has Brit Milah. We're told it's 3 days after his Brit Milah. And so Hashem comes to Abraham, Hashem appears to Abraham, and Rashi explains that Hashem is doing Bikur Cholim. It's a beautiful idea. Hashem is visiting the sick. Abraham is unwell. He's obviously feeling his Brit Milah. He's injured. He's not at his best. And so Hashem comes to visit him. Hashem comes to pay him a visit, and it's a really powerful message just in of itself. That how much more so is that something we should make sure to do. Hashem comes to visit Abraham in his state, and Ramban and Sforno point something very interesting about this kind of phraseology. Hashem appeared to Abraham. It's quite sort of sudden and spontaneous, and they point out that normally when one is sort of engaged in sort of prophetic activities, that one is engaged in a prophecy, there's a lot of preparation that goes into it, and it's a particular type of prayer and prostration and all sorts of activities which are sort of associated with visions, with prophecy. But in this state, it seems that it was more sort of out of nowhere. And what's this saying is that both the Ramban puts this idea forward that Hashem was sort of affirming his love and care for Abraham and this commitment to the covenant that Abraham had gone through the Brit Milah. And so Hashem sort of appeared to Abraham out of nowhere just to be with him, just to do this Bikur Cholim, maybe according to Rashi, just to be with him, just to reassure him of his love and his commitment. And that's why this sort of word appears. Hashem appears to Abraham. And then it says, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent. As Abraham is sitting at the entrance of the tent, the Rashi points out that the word Yoshev could have a vav. Here it doesn't have a vav, it's just spelt with 3 letters. And Rashi points out that Abraham wanted to stand up for Hashem, and Hashem told him, no, I will stand, you will sit. And there's all sorts of fascinating ideas of how that sort of, why that's the case. And it sort of Rashi brings this idea, it reflects throughout history because it says in Tehillim that Hashem will stand in the assembly of judges. So when the judges sit in judgment in the Sanhedrin and the Beit Din, Hashem will stand amongst them. And this is sort of a foreshadowing, a forecast to that. And we have this idea that Abraham is sitting at the entrance of the tent because he's waiting for guests. That's, as we know, Abraham, his key midah, his key character trait is this kindness that he always consistently wants to welcome guests in. And so he's sitting at the entrance of his tent, desperate for guests to come. But the Torah points out, this is not a usual thing for the Torah to do, to tell us the weather. Outside of Noah, which we had a couple of weeks ago, the weather is not very pertinent and is not very relevant to the Torah, and therefore it doesn't tell us much about it. It's not like here in England where it's like the main topic of conversation usually. It doesn't come up unless it's particularly relevant. So why is it telling us here? So Rashi says that Hashem made the day particularly hot and uncomfortable so that there would be no visitors to disturb Abraham, because he wanted Abraham to rest and to get better from his Brit Milah. And so the day was particularly hot. And that's the reason why. However, Abraham nevertheless was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat because of his desire to welcome the guests outweighed any discomfort he felt. And actually these words come up in the Ila, which I find very pertinent, very relevant, because in the Ila we say, Averki fanayom, hayom. We are reminded of Abraham, who sat in the heat of the day, that even in the sort of heat, in the height of his discomfort, he is still sitting there looking to serve Hashem, looking to welcome guests, looking to do the right thing. And I think that's a powerful message for us, that we should always look to do that. But especially in this context, you know, when it comes to Ne'ilah and we're just hungry and tired and thinking about food and struggling and just want to get it over with, here we say the day is fading away. Think about Abraham, who, despite his discomfort, stood there ready and waiting to serve Hashem. And if we move on to the next pasuk in verse number 2, Vayisa Eina Vayar. Look at, there we go again. We see Vayar. He saw, again, the theme's already starting to develop. He lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, 3 men were standing. The translator here is beside him, but literally upon him. And he saw, and he ran towards them from the entrance of his tent, and he prostrated himself to the ground. So we see this idea, Abraham sees them. So firstly, Abraham is so discomforted. This is why we're told, the Midrash tells us that Abraham was more unhappy at not having guests to serve and to welcome in than he was at the idea of wanting to rest from his Brit Milah. And that's why at this particular point, Hashem decided to send the angels. And we're told here they're 3 men, and we're going to discuss later on in the Parsha why they're called men and not angels at this point, but it's fascinating. We'll discuss that later. And what's interesting is it doesn't just say Abraham saw, it says he lifted his eyes, he raised his eyes and saw. And what that indicates, Rashi tells us, is that there's a theme of not just seeing what's in front of you, but actively looking. Abraham was actively looking for the guests. He was actively searching, and that's why he was able to see them. He raised his eyes. He was proactive in that. As we know, that's one of Abraham's core character traits that makes him who he was, that he had this ability to always be proactive, and that's certainly the case here. And we have these 3 men who we know, as we said, are really angels. And of course, there are 3 because we're told that the angels only do 1 task each. And therefore, there's 3, 1 to tell Sarah about her having a child, 1 to heal Abraham, 1 to destroy Sodom. So we have these 3 angels, each with their own specific tasks. I had a question here as well. Why does the Torah repeat the word Vayar? So we see he lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, there were 3 men standing next to him, and he saw, and he ran towards them. And so we have this question: why does the Torah repeat this idea of saw? We just said he saw. So Rashi brings an answer that, based on the Gemara in Bava Metzia, that the 3 men were standing right next to him, and they saw that he was tending to some sort of wound, and therefore they moved away because they didn't want to bother him. And nevertheless, so they were right next to him. He saw them. They moved away. He raised his eyes up, searched them, saw them again. And what does he do? He runs towards them, saying, "No, please come towards me." That's the height of Abraham's proactivity. He runs towards them, even being injured, even not being well. He runs towards them to welcome them into his tent. And that shows how eager he is to welcome people in, and in doing so, to show them kindness and to bring them into this realm of monotheism, which is, of course, his ultimate aim in everything he does. And he bows himself to the ground before him. And there's an interesting idea on this that Rashi brings, that the appearance of these men there was something majestic about them, awe-inspiring, which is why he bows towards them. And he draws a parallel with Eshet Manoach's wife, who is a character from Shoftim, who was Shimshon's mother. And we're going to see a very fascinating parallel between these two characters that continues all the way through this segment. A really fascinating idea that we're going to get to in a bit. But just remember that Eshet Manoach, the story of Manoach, is referenced here as well in a very similar language. And so if we move on to verse number 4, Abraham says to them, please come in, rest, please don't pass away from me. And in verse 4, he says, please let a little water be taken and bathe your feet and recline under the tree. And we have a couple of questions here immediately. The two questions I really had on this verse is, first of all, why a little water? That seems a strange phraseology when you're trying to welcome someone into your home and try to encourage them to come, and you're sort of putting a limitation on the amount of water. Seems a bit bizarre. And the second thing is why this idea of bathing your feet. So Rashi explains famously on the idea of washing the feet that Abraham thought they were Arabs who worshipped at this point these sort of idolatrous practices that involved the dust of the earth. And basically, he didn't want them to have any form of this idolatry within them, so he wanted them to wash the dust off of their feet before they came in, and that's why he sort of stresses to wash their feet. That still doesn't answer this question of why a little bit of water. And I was looking a bit for this, anyone who brought an answer to this, and there's not so many, but one of the answers I found was from the Netziv, who we referenced last week, his sort of backstory about how when he was a boy and he decided to take his study seriously. And he wrote one of the works he wrote was the Emek Davar, his commentary on the Torah. And in that, he effectively says that it's a very sweet idea that Abraham was really desperate to welcome them in, and he was worried they didn't want to come. And it's sort of like, saying to someone, just come in and we'll have a quick chat. He says, if you offer them a lot of water, what they're going to think, well, he's offering me a lot because he wants me to fully wash and he wants me to stay overnight or for a few days, and they won't do it. So if he just offers them a little, they'll think they're just popping by, and maybe they'll come in and they'll stay. And it's a sweet idea that the Netziv brings as to why Abraham specifies a little bit of water, because he was doing everything he possibly could to welcome them in. And they agree, and Abraham rushes around trying to welcome them in and prepare all the necessary preparations that they need for their meal. And if you just look quickly at verse 6 and 7, really the sort of speed and the eagerness of Abraham is so evident. And Abraham hastened via Maher Abraham. Abraham hastens to the tent to Sarah, and he said, hasten 3 seir of meal, hurry up, let's make the meals. And then in the next verse, and to the cattle did Abraham run. Again, Abraham running after the cattle to prepare the meal. His eagerness to welcome these guests is so evident and very inspiring. We go to verse 10. We've just described Abraham preparing all of the different meal items of the meal for his guests. And in verse 10, one of the angels turns to him and he says, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, your wife Sarah will have a son. And Sarah heard from the entrance of the tent, and it was behind him. So this is the angel sort of prophesizing that and telling Abraham and Sarah that they will have a son. Abraham, interestingly, has already been told. If you remember at the end of last week's Edra, Abraham was told by Hashem that he will have a son through Sarah. Now, if we go to verse 11, we see that Abraham and Sarah were old. They were coming on in years, and Sarah was no longer of childbearing age. So in verse 12, Sarah laughed within herself. Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have become worn out, will I have smooth flesh? And also my master is old. She's saying, after I'm no longer able, I passed the age where I'm able to have children. Now you're telling me that I'm going to have Edna is some sort of smooth flesh, is some sort of idea that's connected to pregnancy, that now I'm going to become pregnant at this point. And also Abraham's old. How is this going to happen? This doesn't make any sense. And Sarah sort of laughs within herself. And we see over the next couple of pasukim that there seems to be a rebuke from Hashem saying, why did Sarah laugh? And if you look at verse 14, is anything hidden from Hashem? Is anything beyond Hashem? Are there any wonders that I can't do? I've told you you're going to have a child, you're going to have a child. There's a bit of a rebuke from Hashem here to Abraham about Sarah, that she had this reaction. And what's fascinating is that I would plan to have it up here, but I don't at the moment, and so I'll just tell you. If we remember back to the end of last week's Sedra, when Abraham is told he will have a child through Sarah, he also laughs, and yet there doesn't seem to be, that seems to be sort of a positive thing. And so why is there this contrast that when Sarah laughs, there's a bit of a rebuke about it, but when Abraham laughs, it's seen as a positive thing? It seems to be the same reaction. So I think there's a slight difference which can the commentators pick up on, which can really highlight exactly why there is a different reaction, despite the fact that their actions seem to be the same. The first thing that I think is different, and this is crucial, and we'll see this is a key idea to keep in mind for later as well, is that it says Sarah laughed b'kirba. Sarah laughed within herself. Sarah laughed a sort of internal laugh of disbelief. It wasn't an outward burst of joy. This is what Onkelos says, that he reinterprets the word, that Abraham sort of had this outward burst of joy. Sarah laughed a sort of inward laugh of cynicism and disbelief, and that's reflected by what she says, because she says, how could it's not possible, basically, how could it possibly happen? So there's that kind of laugh, there's that kind of discrepancy and distinction between an internal laugh of disbelief and external laugh of joy that I think is crucial here. And the other thing I think is that she sort of bizarrely claims pins the blame on Abraham. V'adoni zakein, Abraham is old. Abraham is old. It's, how are we going to have a child? Even if I could, how are we going to have a child? And I think that that duality of that reaction is why she is somewhat rebuked. Although if we go to, if we look in the next aliyah in verse 15, we see after Abraham said, Hashem said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? It says, Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, because she was afraid. And Hashem said, he said, no, but you laughed. And I always think that's basically where the story ends. It's a very blunt, no, but you did laugh. I know you laughed. And what's interesting is about this this phrase, V'tachachesh Sarah, and Sarah denied, Sforno picks up on that and basically says, the Torah, the reason that she's sort of says it like this and denies it is because she realizes at that point that she was wrong to have laughed. And she does teshuva at that point. And I think actually, if we pay attention to the details as the rest of the Parsha continues, we see a manifestation of her teshuva. We actually see the process continue onwards, which is going to be fascinating for us. So if we continue on to verse number 20, in these verses here, Hashem says really fascinatingly, should I conceal my plans from Abraham? Abraham is going to be this trailblazer. Abraham is going to be the person who brings my name to the earth, whose children are going to follow after me. Shall I conceal my plans from him? And Hashem says, no, I'm obviously going to tell Abraham what I'm going to do. And so in verse 20, the Lord said, since the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has become great, and since their sin has become very grave, in verse 21, I will descend now and see whether according to her cry, which has come to me, they have done destruction, and if not, I will know. So Hashem effectively says, because of this cry that's come out from Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's become so great, and their sins have become so grave, I will now go down amongst them and see if what's going on. And if things are really bad, then I am going to destroy them. Now, we have a few questions here, I think, to ask. The first question is the zakat. The cry is used in the singular form. Why is it the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah? And links to that, pardon me, is what is this sin that has become so grave? So we have, we were told their sins become very grave, and we were already told in last week's Parsha that they were sinners before Hashem. We talked about the fact that it was before Hashem, it was in front of him, it was knowing Hashem, appreciating and recognizing Hashem was still there, but not caring, still sinning before him. And here we have this idea that their sin being very grave. So what is this sin? Or what are these sins? And then the next question we have is, why does Hashem need to descend and go down amongst them? That seems a bit bizarre. Hashem, who is omniscient, knows exactly what's happening. Why does he need to go down amongst them in order to to see what's going on. And the next question, I guess, is about what's this kind of bizarre phraseology? If not, I will know, what difference does it make? They've already sinned. What difference does it make how they behave going forward? So there's a bit of a fascinating and confusing segment here. We had a really interesting shiur for those who were there on Tuesday morning with Rabbi Sam Lenchik of Belmont. He spoke about this at length, this idea of the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's all sorts of different ideas about why the singular word is used. The first idea is that it's sort of talking about the city as a whole. The city was so sort of united in its evilness that when you talk about a city, it's often used in the female form. And because of that, the singular cry is used because it's the cry of the city. It's the cry of the city reaching out. There's also all sorts of other ideas, and one is a particular idea that this is referencing one of Lot's daughters, that her cry reached out. There was a particular incident, fiercely unpleasant incident that happened to Lot's daughters, and her cry reached out. We're going to talk about that incident perhaps in a bit, but what is this sin then that became so grave that caused this cry? And if you ask people in general, and this was sort of very much what the shiur was about on Tuesday morning, if you ask people what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, the usual answer will be sexual immorality. That will be the usual answer that people form, and there's definitely an element of that which we're going to see in the rest of the Parsha. But when the Mishnah in Avot talks about the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, it talks about their mindset being a mindset of what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. And that doesn't seem such a terrible mindset to have, as opposed to the generation of the flood, who had this mindset of what's mine is mine and what's yours is also mine. That doesn't seem such a terrible thing, that their sin was so incredibly grave. But we go deeper still, and the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, the Midrash, explains even further that they basically said anyone who gives any form of charity or anything to anyone in need will be taken and burnt. And we see from that there's an idea that they actually outlawed tzedakah. They outlawed the giving of charity. They outlawed any form of help to anyone. And that story we reference with Lot's daughter is a story about there was a homeless man who sort of came to what we now call a homeless man, who was staying in the town square, and it was forbidden to help him. And Lot's daughter helped him, sort of tried to help him secretly, and they eventually found out it was her and gave her a rather horrific punishment, which we won't go into. But her cries reached out to Hashem, and that's exactly what happened. So we see the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just the sexual immorality that we often associate, but it's there's their great sin, their attitude about not just not going out to help other people, but forbidding it, ensuring that no one is able to help other people to the extent they'll be burned and other horrific punishments if they do. That is the mindset of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we ask this question, why does Hashem have to go down when he is omniscient? And Rashi comments on this, that we're supposed to learn from Hashem, and this is to teach us that a judge has to be extremely careful with any cases involving capital punishment. And he should only administer the ultimate punishment having looked into the matter most carefully and walking amongst the people and going to look at every single possible detail. And even though Hashem, of course, knows that, he is effectively setting an example for the judges of the Jewish people who are going to follow as well. And if we go to verse 23, we see here the beginning of Abraham's famous debate with Hashem. Hashem tells Abraham of this plan, and Abraham says, would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? How could it be? You are the Lord of justice. How could it be that you will also destroy the righteous as well? And this leads Abraham to this sort of bizarre negotiation where Abraham keeps saying, what if there are 50 righteous men? Is his starting point. And he keeps bringing it lower and lower. And every time Hashem agrees. And we're not going to go through it in any detail. But again, we see, just contrasting Abraham with Noah, that Noah, who we don't see said anything against the flood, Abraham here is willing to sort of argue with Hashem. And that's part of where we get our name from, Yisrael, this idea of wrestling with Hashem, this idea of grappling. And obviously at the end, as we see, we accept Hashem's truth and we accept Hashem's words, and we'll see exactly as Abraham does without any complaint, but to wrestle, to grapple, to understand the truth. And Abraham engages in this negotiation. And if we look at the wordings, I encourage you to do so. Abraham is incredibly respectful, and he says, please Hashem, don't become angry with me, don't allow me to be annoying or disrespectful in your eyes, but what if there are 20? What if there are 10? And he keeps going, And eventually we get to the verse 32, where Hashem says, even if there are 10 righteous people, I will not destroy the city for the sake of those 10. And as we know, there were not 10 righteous people that could be found. And then if we look at verse 33, we see, and the Lord departed when he finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. There's a very interesting idea behind this. The Lord departed when he finished speaking to Abraham. Abraham returns to his place. Rashi sees this whole process, as you might have seen from the metaphor of the judge and Hashem going down like a judge. Rashi sees this whole process a bit like a court case. And he sort of says, at the end of this, the judge left and the defense left because they had nothing left to say. And what was left? The prosecutions, the arguments to destroy Sodom were left there. The arguments to defend Sodom, the defensive counsel, which was Abraham, left. Hashem left the judge. The verdict has really been got to. The other thing to sort of point out here is that Hashem departs when he finished speaking, and then Abraham leaves. And Sforno points out that there is a crucial difference here between Abraham and Cain. Cain that we had in Bereshit, whilst after Hashem was speaking to Cain, the Torah tells us, Vayetze Cain lifnei Hashem, Cain left from before Hashem. And it was like Cain left sort of in the middle of the conversation. Cain left before Hashem did, as a show of disrespect almost. Abraham, even though he's obviously debating Hashem, as it were, at this point, Abraham nevertheless waits for Hashem to leave. He stands as the sort of perfect foot soldier. He stands waiting respectfully, and only after Hashem leaves does Abraham depart. And that's exactly sort of consistent with Abraham's character, that he waits for Hashem. Everything he does is in the context of serving Hashem, even when he is engaged in a debate and an argument with Hashem. And now we get to the beginning of chapter 9. And the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And Lot saw and arose towards them, and he prostrated himself on his face to the ground, with his face to the ground. So the angels come to before Lot. They come to Sodom, and Lot sees them at this point. And this is going to be sort of an interesting narrative, an interesting story that happens. But just before we get to that, I want to point out a few fascinating differences between this beginning to the episode, when these angels appeared before Lot, and when they appeared before Abraham at the beginning of our Parsha, because there's some crucial differences which I think sort of set up the rest of the story for us. First of all, there are two, not three. So what's happened to the third angel? That's the first question we have. Secondly, why are they called angels here? The Torah switches the narrative. Before we called them men at the beginning of the Parsha, even though we knew they were angels, even though the commentators say they're angels, we called them men, and here they're called angels. The next question we have is why is Lot sitting in the gate of Sodom? There's a bit of sort of a comparison there between Abraham at the entrance to his tent and Lot at the sort of gate to the entrance to Sodom. And the final question I have is that when the wording we use, we might have sort of gone quite quickly. I don't know if you picked it up. With Abraham was Vayishtachu arza. He bowed, he prostrated himself on the ground. And here with Lot, we say Vayishtachu apayim arza. He prostrated himself on his face to the ground. Why is that word apayim thrown in here where it wasn't for Abraham? So just to go through those questions and answer them, the reason there were two angels, first of all, is because one of them had done their task. One of them's task was to tell Abraham and Sarah about the child that was going to be born to them. And they had fulfilled that task, and therefore they were no longer part of this journey. The other two had gone on. One was to rescue Lot, one was to destroy Sodom, so they went on. Rescuing Lot is seen, I believe, as part of the process of healing Abraham, which is why it was allowed to have one angel do the same thing. Even though it's two different actions, it's part of the whole overall process of looking after Abraham. That's why Lot was saved. So we have these sort of two angels come. Fascinatingly, this is a bit of a tangent, which I'm not sure we have time for, but we mentioned the thing about Manoach before, that Eshet Manoach was referenced when we spoke about Sarah, and there's a lot of parallels between the story of Sarah being told she was pregnant and Eshet Manoach. They were both barren, they were both told by an angel, and in fact there is an idea that the angel who went to Sarah did not really do his job properly, because Sarah didn't really believe. She was sort of disbelieving until Hashem came and spoke to her. And therefore, the angel still had this role to fulfill. And so according to some, it's the same angel had to wait on this earth, all those sort of probably thousands of years, at least 1,000 years, trying to do the maths quickly in my head, for Eshet Manoach, which is in the time of Shoftim, to the time the Jewish people had gone back to Israel in the time of the judges, to tell Eshet Manoach that she was going to be pregnant, because he had this role to fulfill of telling a woman that she was going to give birth to a miraculous child. And so some say it was the same angel, which is, for those interested in angels and things like that, it's a really interesting idea to look into. Why were they called angels at this point, as opposed to men, which we saw previously? One idea behind this, Rashi brings two ideas, and the first one makes a lot of sense. The first one is, at the beginning, the angels were in the presence of Hashem, and therefore we didn't want to sort of elevate their status, but sort of before Hashem, because before Hashem, everyone is basically equal. And that's why they're called men when they first appear, because Abraham is in conversation with Hashem and Hashem is present. The second reason Rashi brings is really, really amazing, is that it's because they're in the presence of Abraham. And Abraham was such a great man that it didn't seem sort of right to almost elevate them above them. Abraham was basically on their level, and therefore we don't call them angels, we call them men. But here, when they're in Sodom with Lot, they are, of course, on a much higher level to anyone around them, and therefore we revert to calling them angels. We see here that Lot was sitting in the gate. There's also a question about this idea of why it took the angels till evening, because it had been the heat of the day, and now all of a sudden it's the evening, and why there was this sort of delay. The Midrash talks about the fact that angels could kind of make that journey in one step or two steps, and therefore it would take them no time at all. So why did it take all this time? To which the commentators explain that the angels were waiting. They were angels of mercy. It's a fascinating idea, and they were waiting for Abraham's conversation with Hashem, almost in the hope that Abraham would be able to convince Hashem not that they shouldn't go and destroy Sodom, but of course, once that conversation finished, they carried on with their task. Lot was sitting in the gate. He had been just appointed the judge of Sodom, and that's why he was sitting in the gate. That's where the judge sat, that's where the prominent people sat. And he prostrated him on his face. I couldn't really find many answers to this idea of why it says apayim. And I was trying to have a look for it. I couldn't find too many answers. I figure there might just be an introduction here to Lot's character, because whereas Abraham sort of prostrated himself with his full body, Abraham was full-hearted and wholehearted and wholesome and true in everything he did. Lot sort of prostrates himself on his face. I guess it's like a symbol of face value, that he sort of wanted to be seen doing it, but he's sort of maybe holding something back. And that's a theme that we're going to see throughout, that Lot has been brought up by Abraham, so he does have certain values, but he sort of twists them. Everything's a bit sort of twisted in the way Lot does things, and we're going to see that comes to a head in quite an awful way. And if we go to verse 2 and 3, and he said, "Behold now, my lords, please turn to your servant's house and stay overnight and wash your feet, and you shall arise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, we'll stay overnight in the street." And he urged them strongly, and eventually they give in. It's a bit of a bizarre invitation. This really goes along with what we were just saying, that Lot is inviting them. So he does have that hospitable side that he has from Abraham, but the way he says it, this word here, Vayome hinena Adonai surana, please turn to your servant's house. And Rashi explains it means he's going in a sort of a roundabout route, because he doesn't want anyone to know he's hosting the guests. That would be dangerous for him and for them, as we see. He doesn't want anyone to know, so he's sort of inviting them, but in a very roundabout, bizarre way. Please turn, go in a roundabout way, come to my house, but don't make it too obvious. And then even the invitation, he says, first, come to your servant's house, stay overnight, and wash your feet. He should say wash your feet first, like Abraham. And again, things are just a bit confused and twisted around there. And then he says, you shall arise early and go on your way, as opposed to Abraham, who couldn't wait to have people and host them as much as they wanted. Here, Lot sort of saying, just come for the bare minimum time that I can do my duty, and then be on your way and leave. And if we then look at verse 4, the angels come to Lot's home, and when they had not yet retired, so they hadn't gone to sleep yet, the people of the city, the people of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, the entire populace from every end of the city. And they called to Lot, and they said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, and let us be intimate with them." So Rashi points out here that the Torah emphasizes all the people of the city, the entire people of Sodom, from one end of the city to the other, there wasn't a single righteous person, wasn't a single decent person. They all came and joined this sort of crazed mob to engage in these horrific actions. And they demand to Lot, bring out these men, and we are going to engage in these relations with them. We're going to rape them. And you've got this crowd of the entire city beating down on Lot's door. And we see that Lot sort of comes to the entrance and he says to them, my brethren, please do not do evil. And then we see, I think this is one of the most hardest to explain aspects and verses probably in the entire Torah. Lot says to them, behold, now I have two daughters who are not intimate with a man. I will bring them to you. Do to them as you see fit. Only to these men under my roof do nothing, because they have come under the shadow of my roof. And we see Lot offering up his daughters, his young daughters, to this crowd, this crazed crowd, sort of pleading with them not to go after the men in his home. And it's such an incomprehensible thing, and it really shows the sort of completely twisted nature of Lot, that he wanted to look after his guests as Abraham had told him, but he completely missed the point of everything. And Ramban explains in sort of really explicit detail, this is the complete moral degradation of a person. It could not be worse. This is the greatest injustice. He says anyone who could be willing, Ramban says a man must, quoting the Tanchuma, quoting the Medrash, a man must fight to the death for the honor of his daughters and his wife. Any person should fight for the honor of their family. And how he could be so willing just to offer them up is completely unforgivable. And it really shows how confused and just terrible he'd become. Ramban also makes a connection to the Pelegesh Begiva, which is one of the more horrific stories in the Tanakh. It's a fascinating connection. For time's sake, we won't go into the connection between the two stories, but something we can perhaps talk about another time, and how both stories kind of show the real moral degradation of society and the outcome they're in of both. If we move on, we see, Lot says to the people, back away. The people say to him, basically, leave or we'll do worse to you. And the men stretched forth their house, and they brought Lot to them to the house, talking about the angels, and they shut the door. And we see in verse 11, and the men who were at the entrance of the house, this is talking about the crowd who were at the entrance to the house, they were struck with blindness, both small and great, and they toiled in vain to find the entrance. So these people who were trying to commit this act were struck immediately with blindness. What's just unbelievable to think about, and Sforno points this out, is after they've been struck with blindness, what do? They toil in vain to find the entrance. And this is what Sforno says: despite the fact they've been smitten with blindness, they did not desist from their wicked intention. They did not desist. They carried on trying to commit their wicked act, despite the fact they'd already been punished and smitten with blindness. And there's a line in the Gemara in Eruvin which says that the wicked will not become penitents even when they stand at the gates of hell. And that's sort of based on this idea. What happens here, even after they've been afflicted, nevertheless, they're carrying on trying to commit their evil act. And indeed, many people quote that line in Eruvin when talking about things like the Nazis persisting in the final solution, despite the fact that they needed resources elsewhere, that despite the fact it could be their own downfall, they continue with their evil. And if we move on to verse 13, 12 and 13, we see the men said to Lot, whom else do you have here? Son-in-law or daughters, whomever you have in the city, take out of this place, for we are destroying this place, because their cry has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And we see at this point that Lot is being told to take his family and immediately leave, because the sin has become so great that Hashem is going to destroy. There's actually a fascinating parable and comparison between the Sodom, what happens in Sodom, and the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood. Very interesting. Noah and Lot also, their stories really seem to overlap in loads of ways. Here we have these two characters who are far from perfect, but the best in their surroundings, and they're told to take their families and remove themselves from the situation, from the destruction that's about to ensue. And the Dor HaMabul, we know, engaged in those actions of thievery and sexual immorality, and that seems to be the same here with Sodom. And we're going to see how Noah's story continues in even more detail. And so this is what's happened. Noah leaves, and they're told here in verse 17, and it came to pass when they took them outside that he said, flee for your life and do not look behind you. Do not stand in the entire plain. Flee to the mountain, lest you perish. We're told, of course, don't look behind you. Don't look behind you. And of course, we know if we go to verse 26, and his wife looked from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. So Lot's wife, as she goes, who, interestingly, similar to Noah's wife, is not given a name, or her name is not told to us in the narrative, turns around, looks, and she becomes a pillar of salt, as we all know. And we have this question, why was it so bad for them to look behind? And there's all different answers to this. Rashi brings in that you were saved because of purely because of the merit of Abraham. And therefore, it's not fitting that you should witness the sort of doom that really, according to all sort of reason, you should be part of. You should not sort of turn around and witness the things happening to them, because you yourself should have been part of it and were only saved through Abraham. Ramban has an even more interesting idea about the idea of sort of contagion. It's very sort of Ramban language. He talks about contagious diseases, that the plague that was falling upon Sodom and Gomorrah was this contagious thing, and therefore they, looking at it, would link them to it, and therefore they'd be part of the destruction that took place, and that's why she was turned into a pillar of salt. I think there's also just the idea of the metaphorical idea of what Sodom represented, and looking back is linking yourself to that idea. Looking back to that idea is you connecting yourself to that ideology and looking towards that as an idealistic thing. We saw in the previous Parsha that Lot looked towards Sodom as Gan Eden, and he makes that comparison, and Lot's wife turning around and looking back towards that is sort of longing for it. And rather than turning their back, this was your chance to do Shiur and turn your back, literally, physically, metaphorically, spiritually, on all of those things. And Lot's wife failed to do it, and she was punished by being turned into a pillar of salt, because part of the sin that she had done was with salt, because she had gone to guests and asked them for salt, which was how people knew there were guests in the city, and she had obviously done that on purpose. If we go to verse 32, the more bizarre stories continue as we see, come, let us give our father wine and drink, let us lie with him, let us bring life to seed from our father. Lot's daughters think that there are no men left in the world, that everyone's been destroyed, and it's only them who are left. They're in the mountains at this point, that it's only them that are left in the entire world. Their husbands refused to leave with Lot because they saw him as a jester, the Parsha tells us. They thought he was joking, they thought it was a joke, therefore they did not leave with him. So Lot's daughters say, we need to get our father drunk, and so we can continue humanity effectively. And we see this whole episode that happens, and from that we have Moab and Ben Ami, which becomes Ammon, who become two huge nations. Moab particularly causing problems to the Jewish people throughout their history, particularly in the time of the Tanakh. Ammon, who was more amenable, and there's reasons for that as well. What's interesting is we spoke about this comparison with Noah, and yet this seems to be at the end of both of their stories, of the story of Lot and Noah, there seems to be a bizarre instance that takes place. We saw Noah with his son, and here we have Lot with his daughters. And again, there seems to be some sort of link connecting the two, but Lot's daughters is at least seen slightly more sympathetically, because although the action they took was quite horrific, they were doing it because they thought it was their only option, and there was something of a positive desire in them, even though it was completely manifested in the wrong way, which really again sums up Lot. Whereas Noah's son castrated him purely out of selfishness and desire for his own position. So that's something another interesting reflection, and we could do an entire shiur. In fact, my Rav, Jesse Horn, does a fascinating shiur on the comparison between Lot and Noah, and it would be an entire shiur, which we don't have time for now, but it's fascinating to look into in each detail just to see that there is a comparison, and to compare each of them also to Abraham and see how Abraham shines through even further. If we continue now to chapter 20, verse 3. Chapter 20 is all about Sarah is once again kidnapped. Abraham goes to the land of the Pelishtim now, and again he decides tell everyone that you're my sister so that I'm not killed. And again their king Abimelech kidnaps her. It's basically an exact repetition of what happened in Egypt. And the only difference we can see is in verse 3, where God says to Avimelech in the dream of the night, and he said to him, behold, you're going to die because of the woman who you've taken, for she is a married woman. And what's the only difference is that Pharaoh was afflicted with a very painful plague, whereas Avimelech is just told in a dream. And we're told the reason for this is because Avimelech was a more righteous person, and therefore he didn't deserve to have the plagues. He was told in a dream, stay away, and he did exactly that. He stayed away, he didn't touch her, and he returned her straight to Abraham. And this is because he was inherently a more righteous person. And we actually see that in verse 15 at the end of this episode, after Avimelech has returned her to Abraham and given her gifts and realized that Abraham is a man who Hashem has blessed. Avimelech says, here is my land before you, wherever it pleases you may dwell. And if you remember in last week's Parsha, in the episode with Pharaoh's sort of guardians actually drive Abraham. They're saying they're escorting him, but they drive him out of Egypt. Avimelech says, I recognize that you're a great man blessed by Hashem. Hashem is with you. Please stay with me. Please stay in my area, live in my land. He wants to surround himself with the people who who Hashem has blessed, who have the blessing of Hashem, who work for Hashem, and that is why he is a more righteous person, which is why his punishment is nowhere near as severe as was Pharaoh's, despite the fact that their sin was effectively the same in that instance. We go to chapter 21, verse 9. We see that Yitzchak's born, and we go to verse 6, Yitzchak's born. V'tomer Sarah, and Sarah said, God has made joy for me. Whoever hears will rejoice over me. I think this is the complete cycle of Sarah's teshuvah, because she is saying that now, just first her love was cynical and internal, and now it's outward and wishing joy and happiness to the rest of the world. And that wish was manifested itself as Hashem blessed not only Sarah, but we're told, the Midrash tells us that many people, many families who were struggling to have children at that time were blessed with children. Many people who were ill at this time when Yitzchak was born were blessed that they would recover. Sarah's outward laugh, that was the sort of completion of her teshuvah, the joy she wanted to share and reflect on the rest of the world here at this point, it manifests itself in making the world an actual better place. And if we go to verse number 9, we see Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham. It says here making merry. Abraham tzachek. Normally that's translated as making sport. The Yishmael, Abraham's son through Hagar, is sort of making sport. And if you look into the commentators about what does making sport mean, there is you can find almost every possible interpretation of that, from Rashi, who says idolatry and murder, to Ibn Ezra, who says basically he was doing nothing wrong. He was acting like a normal boy, mucking about, doing absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. It was just annoying Sarah because he was the oldest. To Sforno, who says that Yishmael brought up Sarah's kidnap with Avimelech and kept reminding and trying to say to everyone that clearly Yitzchak was not Abraham's son. And that was what she was doing. But anyway, he's making some sort of sport, and Sarah turns to Abraham and demands that Abraham casts them both out, Hagar and Yishmael. And Abraham is really distressed over the matter. He's very upset. But Abraham says, God says to Abraham, listen to Sarah, listen to your wife, whatever she tells you to do. So Hashem also promises that no matter what, he will make Yishmael into a great nation. And so if we look in verse 14, Abraham arose early in the morning, and he took bread and a leather pouch of water, and he gave them to Hagar, and he placed them on her shoulder and the child, and he sent her away, and she went and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. And we have a question. We're going to see that Hagar then was wandering the desert where she ran out of water. She thought she was going to die. She thought Ishmael was going to die. She put him away under some bushes and stepped away so she wouldn't be able to hear the child in pain. And we have this question, why would Abraham not give her sufficient means to get by? Why would Abraham do that to her? And there's all different answers to this question, but effectively, the main answer is that Abraham did give her sufficient means. The Beersheba was not that far away, and really they got lost wandering in the desert, and that's sort of what happened, and that's why this sort of incident happened. And actually that makes sense because Hashem told Hagar that her son will be a person who dwells in the wilderness. And so that's kind of a fulfillment of that happening right here. Another answer is that Abraham drove them away to fulfill what Sarah had said, to fulfill what Hashem had said, but never intended that they would stay away. So he only gave them a little bit of water because he wanted them to come back. They had to be driven away to sort of give them a message. But just like in last week's Sedra, he was hoping they would come back, but ultimately they don't. And we see Vayishma Elokim, Hashem heard the voice, the lad's voice, and an angel of Hashem called out and said, what's troubling you? And if we look here, Vayifkach Elokim et Einah, and God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Again, the idea of the eyes being open. What's fascinating is for Abraham, the tzaddik, he raised up his own eyes. Hagar needs a bit more help. Hashem has to physically open her eyes, but she sees the well of water, and from there, Yishmael grew into a great warrior. We are on our final legs of our Parsha now, as we get to the story we go to chapter 22, verse 1. We see, we've got some interpretation here on this website. There we go. Sorry, Hyde Rush's commentaries. And we see it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to Abraham, he said, here I am. And he said, please take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go away to the land of Moriah and bring him up there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So the first thing to sort of point out is after all of these things, what's that words of after all of these things? And the Gemara in Sanhedrin brings a story of how the Satan would denounce Abraham, saying that, you know, he's hosting all these banquets and everything, and he's not offering anything to you. And Hashem says everything he does for my sake. And the Satan says, prove it, test him, tell him to sacrifice his own son and see then how much he really cares for you. And that's exactly what happens. And what's fascinating, the Torah tells us this is a test, and we can read all sorts of things into that. And of course, the topic of the Akedah Yitzchak is something we could be here about for the next, I don't know, however many years and still not really get to the bottom of. But I just want to point out a couple of things in the next couple of minutes. And he says, take your son, your only son whom you love. And the way he's pointed out to us, commentators tell us, is because it's a conversation. Hashem says, take your son. He says, I have two sons, your only son, I have two sons who you love. I love both of them. And then eventually we say Yitzchak, to the land of Moriah. And if we look in verse 4, in verse 3, we see Abraham arose early in the morning. There's a sense of eagerness, which is very hard for us to understand, but Rashi points this out, to fulfill the word of Hashem, which again, we can't really understand in the context of what's being asked of him, but perhaps we'll understand it a bit better. In the verse 4, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes again. Vayisa Abraham et einav, this theme over and over again. Vayar, again, he sees it. Vayara to makom merachok, he saw the place from afar. And Abraham says to his young man, stay here. And he took up the wood offering. And in verse 7, and Yitzchak spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am, son. And he said, here are the fire and the woods, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? It's interesting that he asked this because according to many of the commentators, Yitzchak knew exactly what was going on, but he asked, where is the lamb for the offering? And God said, and Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And they both went together. First thing I want to point out is how many times the word Vayomer is used in two pasukim. Vayomer Yitzchak Abraham Aviv, Vayomer Aviv, Vayomer Hineni, Vayomer Hinei, Vayomer Abraham, 5 times in two pasukim. Why is that the case? It's not something the Torah we know doesn't waste words. Why does it keep saying it over and over again? That is something we are going to talk about in Shul tomorrow night for anyone who's going to be there. So I won't ruin that now. The second thing I want to point out is this very cryptic answer. God will provide for himself the lamb. And there's all different ways, as I said, there's all different theological ways to understand the test of Abraham, what's going on right now. But perhaps we can understand him literally, that all the time Abraham perhaps doesn't believe Hashem is going to make him sacrifice his son. He sees it as a test of faith, and he has so much faith in Hashem that he's saying Hashem will provide the lamb. We go through it with everything, but we have faith that Hashem will provide the lamb for us. And of course, that's exactly what happens. And if we go to verse 12, verse 13, do not stretch forth your hand to the lad. The angel reaches out to Abraham and says, don't stretch your hands to the lad, don't harm him. And in verse 13, Abraham lifts up his eyes. Vayisa Abraham et einav vayar. Again, he raises up his eyes. Again, he sees, and what does he see? A ram that was caught by the trees in its horns. And Abraham sacrifices the lamb to Hashem. that is really, again, Abraham raising up his eyes and searching. When you've been through a test and a challenge and a task and a hardship, we can't imagine Abraham's hardship, but for any of us, any sort of hardship, any form of difficulty, when we go through that, can we imagine having been through that and being told, no, it was just a test? Our first thought is, okay, but what can I do to serve Hashem? That should be our first thought. It's such a hard mindset to have, but that's our legacy. That's what Abraham was. That's why the shofar is the symbol of this story and the symbol of Judaism in many ways, because it's raising up our eyes and searching for opportunities that we need to find and need to always strive after. And we then see, if we go to verse 19, I mentioned at the beginning that the end of the Parsha is really fascinating and tells us a lot just as the beginning. And I always ask this question. Abraham, we have this unbelievable story, one of the most crucial stories of our history in Akedat Yitzchak, that we went through very quickly just because, firstly, everyone knows the story, and also we could be here for days. But we went through this story of the Akedat Yitzchak, this crucial story in our history. And I always ask people, how does it end? How does the story end? What's the end to the story? How does it go? Because the end to the story blows my mind. It's unbelievable. Look at verse 19. And Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham remained in Beersheba. Abraham returned to his young men. This whole story was about the sacrifice of Yitzchak. Where's Yitzchak? Where did Yitzchak go? Abraham returns to the young men who accompanied him. Abraham goes back to where he was. Where's Yitzchak? How could you have this story and not tell us where Yitzchak is? What's going on? And the answer to that question we will deal with, please God, next week. Thank you very much, everyone. If we have any questions, I'll look on the chat, and we will continue and look forward to seeing everyone next week.